All right, welcome back. Now, the point that I was trying to make at the end of the last video, which got cut off, kind of strangely, I apologize for that, is that the East India Trading Company, this massive monopoly that rose in England, that oversaw the sub-Asian continent of what is now India for well over 100 years, this monopolistic company took resources from India and other places around the world and turned them around and then sold them in markets, European markets, and also to the colonies. The East India Trading Company would sell a lot of tea to the colonies until the colonies realized that not only could they grow tobacco and other stuff over here, but they could grow tea that was not quite as good as the tea in India, but it had the advantage of A, being American homegrown tea, and B, you could get it quicker, as opposed to waiting for the next shipment of tea coming into New York Harbor or Boston Harbor. Now, the East India Trading Company starts to have economic problems. In a sense, it's too huge, right? And it is so close politically, so cozy with the British government, that King George feels compelled to save the East India Trading Company, to help it economically, even if it hurts many of the English people and colonists, English colonists here in America. So what they do, as you'll recall, is he places a tax on American-grown tea, such that American tea now suddenly is more expensive than tea brought in by the East India Trading Company through Europe from India. So tea that you make in your own fields is more expensive suddenly, thanks to King George, than tea that is brought to you from clear across the world from India, right? That understandably outrages the colonists. Back then, there were no drugs. There was very little alcohol at the time, not in the sense that we understand it, and there was no coffee. So tea was the stimulant, and so this righteously upset the colonists, and this was the cause for, of course, the Boston Tea Party, right? Which is one of the great acts of defiance by the American colonists, demonstrating to themselves, but also to King George, that in fact, this tension between the colonists wanting freedom, economic freedom, and King George and his need to maintain power over the colonists and maintain that captured market. Those 13 colonies were an increasingly important market for the East India Trading Company, King George's buddy, to dump their products, right? And the king's job, in part, the way he exercised it, was to make sure that the colonists had an artificial economic incentive to have to buy East India Trading Company products like tea, as opposed to products that they could grow or manufacture on their own, because the king could impose taxes on American-grown products. Now, in the 1750s and 1760s, this growing tension between the 13 colonies and King George is not lost on Adam Smith. Adam Smith is going about his business teaching moral philosophy, what we would understand to be law, sociology, history of religion, ethics, morality. All of these subjects, which are now basically the social sciences on any modern university, all of these subjects were subsumed and included within the broader academic category of moral philosophy. And early economic thinking that began to incorporate semblances of market principles were developed by Adam Smith during this time period. And as he's developing his economic thinking, one thing is increasingly obvious to him, as I mentioned near the end of our last truncated video, and that is that monopolies are bad. Monopolies are inherently bad because they stifle competition. After all, if only one guy can provide tennis shoes, right? And you can't buy tennis shoes from anybody else. Let's say Nike. Phil Knight, the CEO of Nike, is the only guy who can sell tennis shoes. He's got a monopoly, right? There's no Vans, there's no Under Armour, there's no New Balance, there's no Reebok. There are no other competitors. What do you think the price is going to happen in Nike shoes? You think they're high now? They're going to skyrocket, right? Because you can't go anywhere else. What do you think might happen to the product? Is Phil Knight and the rest of Nike, are they going to care as much about the product when they know that you got to buy it and you got to buy it from them? Perhaps not. So it occurs to Adam Smith that monopolies are bad from a market perspective in terms of competition. But it also becomes increasingly clear to Adam Smith that there's another insidious dark side to monopolistic power. And that is that monopolies, all too often, as was the case with the East India Trading Company, as Adam Smith pointed out repeatedly in Wealth of Nations, monopolies can use and abuse their economic power, turn it into political power, and get politicians to do what the monopolies want them to do, which may well be in the best interest of the monopoly. But Adam Smith realized what a monopoly wants politically is almost always to the detriment of the masses, almost always to the detriment of the people. I think of Wealth of Nations as a remarkably democratic masterpiece, because what Adam Smith is doing is he is suggesting that the key to human material success at long last lies in government getting out of the way and allowing people to pursue their own genius, to grow their own stuff, to sell their own stuff at whatever prices a competitive market will bear. Competitive meaning no monopolies. Monopolies destroy competition. The destruction of competition by monopolies ultimately will make a market economy crumble. And so that becomes the genesis and the core of Adam Smith's thinking. Now, there is posted in our first module component, as you'll see on Canvas, there is this video entitled, I believe it's entitled, The Real Adam Smith. I'm asking you to please take a look at that. It's only about 55 minutes. I think it's very much worth your while, because I think it does, and I've seen a lot of videos on Adam Smith the last several years, and I think for documentaries that are less than an hour, this one's pretty darn good. So take a look at it and familiarize yourself really with the genius that is Adam Smith. It focuses more on his Wealth of Nations, of course, because that has historically been the focus of most people ever since he wrote Wealth of Nations. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to go through some of the basic tenets, TENETS, right? The basic core principles and characteristics of the Wealth of Nations. A couple of things I want to point out about the Wealth of Nations as we change our slide here. Here, as you can see, there are no photographs, no Instagram at the time. These are two presumably representative likenesses of Adam Smith. Adam Smith was born in 1723 in Scotland, died in 1790 in his native Scotland. He lived almost his entire life, actually, in Scotland. For a brief period of time, he lived and studied in London, was not very satisfied with that experience, and returned to do his teaching at the University of Glasgow. Other than that, the only other time that Adam Smith spent any significant period of time outside of Scotland or outside of the British Isles at all was during the 1760s, when he got a job basically as a tutor to some rich guy's kid, and which was very common for sophisticated intellectuals like Adam Smith at the time, right? Very often they would be hired by rich families to take their kids, almost always a boy, of course, and take the boy on a coming of age journey across Europe to educate the boy on the humanities and the arts and the letters and literature and architecture, and to tour Europe and to learn basically to use this prolonged vacation experience as an educational opportunity. So basically, they would be a private tutor to somebody and take them from major township to major city to and major museums and universities and educate the young lad as to the ways of the modern world. Adam Smith was able to do that in the 1760s. And as I suggested before, it's in the 1760s, particularly in France, where he has private, prolonged, long discussion, long talking sessions and collaborations with the leading economists of Europe at the time, including the leading French economist, this guy named Quesnay. And it's while he is traveling in Europe, and particularly in France, and while he's interacting with other intellectuals throughout Europe who are thinking about economics, who are thinking about the new Europe that is experiencing increasing material wealth. This is where Adam Smith refines his economic thinking. Now, by this time, as you can see here on the slide, in the 1760s, when he's touring Europe with this young lad, he's already written Theory of Moral Sentiments. So he has established his broader thesis that the most important thing that any society, any individual can do is to establish a strong moral foundation. And in Theory of Moral Sentiments, Adam Smith, I think, brilliantly gives us instructions. I think of Theory of Moral Sentiments as a DIY. It's a do-it-yourself book. He actually gives us instructions, as I'll get into in the next lecture or two. He actually gives us instructions on how throughout our life we can perfect the art of being the just, righteous, and virtuous person. Then he goes to Europe, refines his already well-developed thinking on economics, comes home from Europe after a few years, and begins writing the masterpiece known as the Wealth of Nations. Theory of Moral Sentiments, published in 1759, 17 years later, just a few months before the beginning of the American Revolution, actually. As The Wealth of Nations is published in early 1776, the founding fathers of the United States are already meeting in Philadelphia. And it's around this time that they realize that the time to break with England and to go to war with King George's army and navy has come. And they need somebody to put into writing, to characterize, to memorialize, to enunciate, and to pronounce in as compelling way as possible the reasons why these several dozen guys in Philadelphia, the reason why these guys think that everybody across the 13 colonies needs to join them, take up arms, and do battle with what is, after all, at the time, the greatest military power on the face of the earth, King George's army and navy. And of course, they turn to Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin essentially says, no, if you want this done right, you got to go to Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson then heads up the small committee that drafts the Declaration of Independence. But we know that the principal author of the Declaration of Independence is, of course, Thomas Jefferson, whose writing in the Declaration is clearly, largely, significantly influenced by John Locke, as Adam Smith was influenced significantly by John Locke. But I want to suggest to you that Adam Smith was also, to some measure at least, influenced by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, because they were writing at about the same time. And there's a fascinating book review written by Adam Smith in, I think, 1760 or so. A book review by Adam Smith analyzing, critiquing, and mostly celebrating Jean-Jacques Rousseau's classic Discourse on Inequality. So some more about Adam Smith and his economic thinking in our next video.